Book TV attends numerous book fairs and festivals throughout the year. Recently, we were at the National Press Club's book fair in Washington and spoke with Rebecca Boggs Roberts about the women's suffragist movement in Washington, D.C. in 1913.
Rebecca Boggs Roberts is the author of Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 parade and the fight for the vote. Can you tell me what happened in Washington in 1913 in regards to the suffragist movement?
So by 1913, the suffrage movement had really started to languish. The original founding mothers were long dead, and there had been a lot of fights after the Civil War about what direction the movement should go in. And it had been a really long time. Seneca Falls had been way back in 1848. So there needed to be an injection of enthusiasm, some new ideas, some new recruits, some new money. And Alice Paul, who had been in England for grad school and had gotten exposed to the British suffrage movement, which was much more aggressive, came back and proposed this parade. And it was the first Civil Rights March. The idea was that it would go from the Capitol to the White House, right down Pennsylvania Avenue, from the legislative branch to the executive branch, and it would coincide with the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. So it would announce to this president that they hadn't voted for, right from the very beginning, you need to pay attention to women. Obviously, lots of parallels with contemporary Washington and women's voices in contemporary politics. And so the lessons from the suffrage movement remain incredibly relevant almost 100 years later.
You write this was the first Civil Rights March to use the nation's capital as a backdrop.
Right. So this idea of bringing your cause to the heart of federal Washington. There had been parades on Pennsylvania Avenue, celebratory parades, but this idea of there is something we want, and we want it from the federal government, and we're going to march down the middle of where the federal government sits and demand it. So one of the very first things in this parade was a big sign that said, "We demand a constitutional amendment enfranchising women." One very clear sentence of what it was that they wanted. And that was the first time that had happened. And frankly, Washington, D.C. police were not delighted by this whole idea. They were really worried that there would be riots and that the police force would be stretched too thin. They wanted the women to march down 16th Street instead and said, you can still enter the White House if you march down 16th Street, but it's much wider and safer. And Alice Paul said, we don't want safe. We're going to march where the men march. We're going to march down the corridors of power. This is where we're going to be.
What was the city's reaction? What was the media's reaction?
So the march was incredibly well planned. There were amazing details, floats and bands and women marching by profession, and it was all supposed to happen in this very grand way. And when the beginning of the march, the women at the beginning of the march were on horseback, and they got up on their horses and they looked down Pennsylvania Avenue, and it was shoulder to shoulder with crowds. You couldn't see the street. Pennsylvania Avenue is a really broad street, but the crowd absolutely covered it, and it was all men. They weren't there for the suffrage march. They were there for the Wilson inauguration the next day. The suffrage march was a sideshow. And they blocked the parade route. And they yelled names at the women, and they spit at the women, and they hurled insults and tripped them. The police did nothing to stop it. In some cases, the police joined in the tripping and the spitting and the name-calling. And the women had to fight their way down through this entire blocked 15-block stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue. But Alice Paul recognized right away that it was the best thing that ever could have happened to them. Because a perfect parade would have been in the news for a day, and a near riot kept the suffrage movement in the news for months. There were hearings, the police chief lost his job, and people became much more aware of the movement and the way these women were treated.
Did you see parallels 2 years ago with the Women's March and the 1913 March? I think about the photo I saw circulating of the women on horseback in these gilded outfits from 1913, I believe.
The outfits in 1913 were way better than the ones in 2017. It is no contest. The 2017 March had many more women participating, but there are so many parallels. First of all, the timing. It was inauguration weekend for both of them. And it was on purpose, inauguration weekend. And the capital city is a backdrop. I mean, how many pictures did you see of the 2017 March of fields of women with the Capitol behind them? And even the pink hats, which weren't as cool as the costumes they had in 1913, were a unifying theme to identify women to each other and to news cameras, that they were united in this cause.
How far did people travel in 1913 to attend this march?
They came from all over the country in 1913, which is amazing to me because they didn't get the permit for Pennsylvania Avenue until like December for a march in early March. So they had to get women there and plan all the logistics in a pre-digital age communications environment. But women came from all over. And they needed places to stay, and they wanted their trains met, and they wanted to be appreciated and feted, and many times they'd never done this before. Nice girls don't march down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a little shocking. The advantage to all those women coming from all over was that then they all went back to their hometowns, and their hometowns all wrote articles saying, you know, Mrs. George Morris was tripped and harassed on Pennsylvania Avenue when she tried to go march for women's suffrage. And it had the effect of spreading the news, both about the day, but more important about the movement all around the country because the women brought the news back with them.
Rebecca, for your day job, you're a program coordinator at Smithsonian Associates. Did you do any of your research at the Smithsonian?
The Smithsonian has a pretty good women's suffrage collection. And as we approach the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, there are going to be some really great exhibits mainly at the National Museum of American History. And the Smithsonian has just launched an American Women's History Initiative. So there's actually going to be American women's history infusing all of the Smithsonian museums over the next couple of years, which I'm really looking forward to.
Rebecca Boggs Roberts, she's the author of Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 Parade, and the Fight for the Vote. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Keep an eye out for more interviews from the National Press Club's Book Fair to air in the near future. You can also watch them and any of our programs in their entirety at booktv.org. Type the author's name in the search bar at the top of the page.